I'll give you a little bit of a lecture. This is going to sort of serve as a basis for the seminar that we have later on after this, but it's going towards discussion, I suppose, of what my main research interest in is as a researcher that looks at lobbying and looks at the regulation of lobbyists. Thank you. So what does this mean? Well, it kind of means that we have to take it a bit back to the beginning for our students who aren't necessarily formal scholars of politics in particular to look at basic concepts of what we mean by a political system, how we can see interest groups or lobbyists as an essential and legitimate part of that political system, and then how we can conceptualize or categorize different types of interest groups. We'll take a look then specifically to see how are interest groups operating in the European Union and who are the main actors. And then we'll get to this rather nebulous, although it's an increasingly important concept of regulation of lobbyists, not only in the European Union, but throughout the globe. And this is where our global work comes in, is what we basically try to do, and this is a very difficult thing to do, but it's a difficult task, but it's a really good task if you think you can do it well in the end, is basically try to compare laws across multiple jurisdictions across the world to see how they compare to each other. So without running too much ahead of ourselves, let's just go right back to the beginning. In a sense, and so that's the title of the talk, it's basically to look at lobbying and its regulation, comparatively analyzing developments in the EU with what's going on in the rest of the world. So for our prospective students in particular, this is to show a little bit what this program does, is that we do comparative European analysis, but also we can try to take that comparative European analysis and situate it with what goes on globally in the world. So this is something that you'll see is pretty clear once we get to the comparing of the different political systems throughout the world. So this is something that we all know as political scientists, a political system, what it is. And this goes back to the earlier definitions from the 1950s and 60s of authors such as Almond and Easton that defined what a political system is. I'm cognizant of death by PowerPoint, and when you see a slide like this, it's a bit of a turn-off, and I understand that. So I actually asked them, I said, well, do you think I can get something on paper so I could actually just put this how I would really do it in a classroom and not by PowerPoint? There's really 4 elements to a political system that I think you can visualize a lot easier if you think of it this way. The first element will be its institutional level. So when we talk about different institutions in a political system, we're thinking here of the House, the Senate, courts, bureaucracies. Okay, those are basically these institutions that are involved in all stages of policy making, right, that working together will create laws. So that's the first element. Now the second, and this is the point why I have that in bold over there, the actual inputs into that political system. We know that people will somehow try to influence what goes on in the institutions, but they can't really, in representative democracies, do that directly. So there are what we refer to as gatekeepers that are always at play in basically trying to input those views and values of citizens into the institutions directly. So most obviously, the main input would be through political parties, right? So we know political parties try to compete against each other to gain representation in the different institutions, particularly the executive and the parliament. So that traditionally has been the main avenue to input into the political system. However, and this is where interest groups come in, the second way that citizens' views are expressed into those institutions are through interest groups. All right? Now, I use the term interest groups and lobbying interchangeably. Now, there's a lot of people that might see a distinction between them, but there really isn't any distinction between them, right? We'll go over a more formal definition of what we mean by interest groups in a second. But basically, these are actors with different values that seek to have those preferences reflected in legislation, right? There's neither good nor bad interest groups. We oftentimes think that there are good lobbies and there are bad lobbies. The corporate lobby is the bad lobby. This is conventional wisdom. Whereas NGOs or different civil society organizations are okay lobbies. We don't make that distinction. In the literature, generally we don't make that distinction. I think scholars working on that don't make that normative distinction. These are all actors who are seeking to try to influence the policy process. All right? So basically then, the third element of a political system are policy outputs. That basically is a fancy way of saying institutions create laws. And those laws, we've said before, are influenced by the interest groups and the political parties that try to seek to influence those institutions. And then the fourth is this type of feedback between the outputs and then the impact it has on people's lives that then flow back into a cyclical conceptualization of a political system. Why have I said all this, other than to go through something that's relatively basic? It's to say something fundamentally simple. That interest groups are legitimate actors in a political system. Lobbyists are legitimate actors in a political system. We oftentimes in the press will hear that lobbies are bad because they seek to influence, maybe disproportionately, sometimes legislation, right? But in our view, and most of the literature, the comparative politics scholars working on this, interest groups are a legitimate and a necessary part of any political system. So when we start from that premise, we're going to look at interest groups from a relatively positive perspective. They're not bad actors. Well, they might be morally bad. I'm not making any judgments on that. They might have different views, but they would be as bad as any other actor in any political system, right? But they are legitimate in terms of what they try to influence. All right, so we go to a more formal definition then of an interest group or a lobbyist. This is taken from stuff that my co-author and I, Sylvia Kritziger, looked at way back, but to be fair, there are several authors in the literature that have defined interest groups and lobbyists in a similar way, even though we might not always have the same definition. So one of the things that we found when we've advised governments on lobbying laws is that one of the most difficult things to do is to give a precise definition about what a lobbyist is, or even to give a precise definition about what lobbying is. So there's a point when we kind of have to say, well, we'll take this definition and we'll work with it. So just as a broad one, we'll go over Jan Beer's definition in a second, but in our view, any group of or set of actors, or say any group or set of actors that has common interests that seek to influence policy making. Now that's an important point to underline. Seeking to influence isn't necessarily influencing. It is the attempt to influence that a lobbyist is basically responsible for. They may be successful sometimes, they might not be successful at other times, but they do try to seek to influence policy in such a way that the policy would be reflective of their interests. Now this is assuming that a policy needs to be developed. In other cases, a lobbyist might lobby to maintain the status quo. Now that's a very important point to know, because there may be laws on the cards right now that lobbyists are very happy with, and they wouldn't want a government to change that policy. Can anyone think of an example of that where a lobbyist or an interest group would want to maintain the status quo? Sorry? Taxes.
Against taxi. Cabs.
Okay, sure. How do you think that they would try to maintain the status quo?
By opposing
Great, good example, right? So the status quo, okay, assuming that the status quo doesn't allow Uber to exist, right? If the regulations are in place that do not allow Uber to exist, in that scenario, the taxi lobby might want to keep that position so as to prevent Uber from functioning. Okay, excellent example. Any other examples? Did you say tax?
No, I talked about taxes, but I can think about the American arm industry.
Okay, NRA, National Rifle Association, wants to maintain the status quo by not having regulations enacted which would make it more difficult to purchase or use weapons. Okay, excellent. Another example. Well, for my country, Ireland, I'm actually Canadian, just to be clear, but in the country I live in, which is Ireland, right, one of the big things that business wants to maintain is the low corporate tax rate in Ireland, right, that has the rest of the European Union really angry, right, with our 12.5% corporate rate compared to the rest of the EU, which effectively, and this is something that, our researchers could maybe come out working either in DG competition for or studying in their dissertation, right, it effectively constitutes an unfair state aid by allowing corporations to pay lesser tax in Ireland compared to, say, France, right? Lack of harmonization of fiscal policy in the EU allow for these sorts of things to take place. But it's an example of where you would see a corporate lobby that wants to see the position of where the state is right now to be maintained. Okay? So a lot of the lobby, and this is Frank Baumgartner's argument of the United States, that takes place effectively is to maintain the status quo. Now, of course, when there are policies on the cards to be developed, lobbyists will try to influence those as well. But a lot of the work, too, is just to make sure things don't change. All right? So this is another example or example of a definition by other scholars in the field, Jan Beres et al., to define what interest groups are. And it's worth looking at in some detail because there's three dimensions to it that are pretty clear. They're an organized form of political participation. So this is in contrast to public opinion, which is basically a snapshot of what people might think at a certain point in time. And it's reflective of mass publics. Organized interest groups or lobbyists will basically have specific views and will always make sure that those views are put into motion in trying to influence what goes on at the institutional level. Again, it's that dynamic of seeking to influence institutions. They are informal, but they also can be formal as well. But I think what they're trying to say in this case is that they do not run for public office. So there is a clear differentiation between interest groups and political parties. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that members of interest groups can't go into political parties later on, right? In fact, we see this kind of revolving door phenomena where you might have corporate CEOs or executives that effectively would constitute lobbyists from the firm perspective, then later on going into political parties and government. So that does exist. But as they stand as institutions, they are differentiable from political parties. Okay? They do represent political interests. And what we mean by that effectively is that they seek to influence policy making. So that third definition from Beres et al. Effectively is just a confirmation of what we understand as a political system. Is that lobbying is a political activity in the sense that it seeks to influence the development of policies. Okay? So those are just definitions to go over. When we do this work, we always try to conceptualize or characterize what do we mean by interest groups or lobbyists in terms of their classification. Again, debated how much to put on this in this presentation because I could have probably spent the whole presentation talking about the different authors in the literature that talk about different ways of classifying interest groups. But because we're going to be coming full circle a little bit to what goes on in the EU in this topic, I thought, well, why don't we just go about how the European Union, that is the EU level of governance, categorizes different types of interest groups or lobbyists. So the first main actor when it comes, and a lot of, even our prospective students that are watching this, or students that are here, a lot of you will come with skills to be able to use the training that you've learned in your undergraduate and your graduate training to be able to solve problems quickly and easily. And a lot of that problem-solving ability is what consultancies are looking for, particularly when they're looking to find solutions to things such as how do we represent Corporation A, interest group B, or whichever actor they've actually been used by or being hired by to represent them. So effectively, consultancies are guns for hire, that they will be available for different interest groups, different corporations, different professional associations to represent their interests and try to seek to influence policy on their behalf. So here we're talking about different consultancies such as Deloitte, Accenture, KPMG, right? These are different organizations that firms or different interest groups will go to help them solve problems. And some of those problems might be relating to developing legislation that they want to have those specific interests represented in that legislation. So they'll use these consultancies or guns for hire. So that's really the first main category in our conceptualization, always as lobbyists. Now, Traditionally, consultancies were the ones that did a lot of the high-powered lobbying in Brussels and in the European capitals. But particularly since the 1980s, and this we see through David Cohen's work as well, increasingly firms themselves have done lobbying on their own behalf. They haven't hired someone to do it for them. They've actually had part of their corporate wing, which is actually involved in lobbying for the firm. So you will see different organizations such as Google, Apple, you can think of any of the major electricity companies, airlines, telephone communications companies. They will have offices in Brussels that are dedicated to lobby the European Union, right? David Cohen's work in the 90s said that we've clearly seen this trend towards more of these in-house corporates we refer to them as, doing lobbying for themselves, right? Today, we can see that that's clearly the case. And when we go to the actual numbers of the European Union lobbyists that we see today, we will see that firms, in particular, and trade associations, will be the highest active lobbyists in the European Union. Okay? And of course, we have different NGOs, non-governmental organizations, also referred to as civil society organizations that are involved in lobbying. And then we have 5, 6, and 7, which are relatively more minor ones, research institutions, think tanks, religious organizations. The EU considers territorial organizations. I think that wouldn't be part of our conceptualization of lobbyists generally, but we include it there because they put that in their classification scheme. So if I try to define what's meant by a lobbyist, I'm going to try to define what's meant by lobbying. Now you're all looking and saying, well, this is really serious. Trust me, there's nothing worse if you have 20 policymakers either from all around the Council of Europe or from any jurisdiction, and you say, we want to write in our legislation how we define lobbying and lobbying activity or lobbyists. They will all come up with 23 different definitions. It's absolutely insane. So we'll keep it simple, and it basically is related to our earlier definition of lobbying that we looked at, or lobbyists that we looked at before. So it's basically any individual, the act of any individual or group, which may have a specific interest, and may generally have varying interests as well, seeking to attempt to influence decisions at the political level. Again, seeking to attempt to influence decisions. It could also include seeking to attempt to communicate on political decisions. The difference slightly there is that historically people have said, well, we only communicated on it, we didn't try to influence, so we're really not lobbying. Well, I think that was a little deceptive, and it's probably untrue, because any communication is effectively an attempt to try to influence as well. So I think maybe that caveat could be put into that definition as well. How do they try to influence or communicate on a specific political decision? Well, you can do it, and this is generally from our political system analysis, there's the institutional strategy, which includes direct communications with government officials, to offer presentations, potentially give draft reports, telephone conversations, and the old important one, having a meal with somebody, right? We oftentimes think that that isn't an act to seek to influence, when oftentimes it's probably one of the most effective way to try to influence somebody. And in fact, lobbyists that we've talked to in Brussels have said one of the most important tricks they learned when they first started was to learn how to have 3 or 4 glasses of wine, right, in their first lunch with a government official and still be successful in their lobbying strategy. All right, so the other way you can try to influence, which has less to do with the political system, but its intentions are still the same, to seek to influence the institutions in the political system, is to go public. This can include grassroots lobbying through the media, through protests, or to mobilize public opinion. Generally speaking, if you have to choose between those 2 strategies, the more effective one would be the first institutional strategy. The second one can be more resource intensive, and it may not necessarily be as successful as you would have otherwise wanted to, because there's not always the guarantee that going public is really going to have any effect. Okay? So that's just something that I think all interest groups or lobbyists always try to calculate is a cost-benefit analysis as to whether which of these is going to be more effective or not. Okay? All right, so whether we like it or not, we know in terms of a political system, it's a legitimate act to seek to influence policy as a lobbyist, but there really are some benefits to lobbying as well, right? I won't go through each of these, but I suppose one that we oftentimes overlook is that interest groups themselves or lobbyists, their actions can help promote debate and open up discussion and increase education amongst the public. And they would increase participation effectively in the political system as well. Why do you think that would be the case? How would having interest groups increase participation in politics amongst the larger public? Any views? Well, okay, so imagine that you actually, as a citizen, had an interest, for example, in saving the earth or to create higher environmental standards. You on your own aren't necessarily going to be able to do that or have much impact because you're not part of an organized group that may have more resources to be able to try to influence institutional structures. So by joining an organization, Friends of the Earth, for example, you yourself are going to directly increase your participation in politics by joining an organization that seeks to influence the policy that comes out, right? So effectively, the more people that join interest groups, this is the argument, the more people that join interest groups, the more that they're going to increase their participation in the world of politics. You're not just participating now by voting every 4 years, right? Traditionally, our idea of participation in politics is to vote every 4 or 5 years, right? But you can constantly participate by being members of different organizations, right? Whether that's Friends of the Earth, Amnesty International, etc. You can think of the different organizations that exist, right? Also, from the corporate perspective, you can be involved in trying to influence as well. If you're part of a company, right, you can try to make that company's position a bit better globally by being involved in lobbying strategies as well. Okay? Those are the different types of benefits of lobbying. Now, this is where we get back to the disadvantages of lobbying, of our original perceptions before we actually probably studied our formal study of interest groups. The main disadvantage is the first one. We always see that those lobbyists who are financially strong being able to exercise more power than other lobbyists that don't have as many resources, right? So here we see that one of the disadvantages of lobbying is that it effectively promotes inequality. The more money you have as a lobbyist, the more resources you can pump into your lobbying strategy, meaning more people to work as lobbyists, more offices throughout the globe that could potentially try to influence decisions in different countries in the world, right? But if you don't have those resources, you're going to be in a competitively disadvantageous position compared to those financially strong lobby groups, right? So if you even think of things such as environmental standards or to control CO2 emissions, right? Let's say there's a controlling of emissions that are related to something that comes out of a car, right? So you can see car manufacturers potentially, with more money, being able to convince a government to not enact tighter regulations because it's going to be more costly to them, right? Whereas another organization, environmental group, I'm aware I'm not going to mention names, or you can think of any, or environmental group that may not necessarily have the same amount of money. They are not going to be able to challenge necessarily the car makers because they don't have the resources to collect the data necessarily to convince policymakers, right? Okay, I'm not saying that it's just an example of the type of argument that's made with regard to one of the disadvantages of lobbyists, right? I guess the other thing to mention here is the third point. In the end, when you vote for a political party every 4 or 5 years, you have, I suppose, the right and you have that power to be able to get rid of governments, right? You can vote them in, you can vote them out. Effectively, public officials are accountable for their actions, those who are in the executive and those who are in the assemblies or the legislatures. Interest groups, and this is where I say, okay, leaders of corporations can make decisions. They effectively lobby governments to act in that firm's interest, Apple, Google, you name it, right? But no one's ever going to replace those corporate leaders that are the bigger lobbyists. They are effectively not accountable to the public for their actions that have a big impact on the public, right? Think of our corporate tax rate in Ireland, right? That the big corporates don't want that to be changed effectively has a big impact on every person in the EU, right? If you think about that difference between corporate tax rates and what that effectively means for your different fiscal regimes, right? So these are examples of where you can see a lack of accountability in the process made by interest groups, okay? Now that being said, we know they exist, so going from the disadvantages to them and the benefits to them, what exactly are we looking at in terms of numbers here? Okay, so this works. All right, so the question here is how many interest groups are there in the European Union? Now this graph is somewhat deceitful because it makes it look like since 2011, oh God, it's increased so much. That isn't what we want to say exactly in this. This is really a measure of how many interest groups were registered in the Joint Transparency Register in the European Union since it started in 2011. So that's why the evolution is a positive slope, because it started from 0 registrants to now the 11,000. Now that said, in the 1990s, the number that was battered around by everybody about, how many lobbyists do we have in Brussels, this magic number of 15,000 came from somewhere. No one really knows where that came from, but it sort of took on this mythical status, right? I don't know if it's right, but, well, we're getting close to there anyway. If you look at how many lobbyists we have today, we have almost 11,500 that are registered. Now, this data maybe is a little bit of a time lag of a few months, but, say it's around 11,500 or 12,000 lobbyists that are there. Now, of this, do you get the audio here? Sorry, I'm not speaking into the mic. Of this, you can see that there are different types of lobbyists that have evolved, right? So the in-house lobbyists, which is the second line, okay, so it's the second line here. This is the highest number of the subcategory of lobbyists. So when we say in-house lobbyists and trades and business associations, this was talking about effectively what David Cohen was saying about the in-house corporates that were involved, taking on their own lobbying themselves without hiring it out to consultancies. Now that said, the non-governmental organizations are here at number 2, and then we'd have professional consultancies and law firms at number 3. So traditionally, our traditional conception of lobbyists was that it was always going to be these persons that were acting on behalf of their clients. But what this is clearly showing is that evolution now is that a lot of this is done by in-house corporates themselves and civil society organizations. I guess a more telling graph to give you a little bit of a pie chart of that sort of who lobbies the EU today, and this is effectively the same thing at the end of that time series, but in the more pie graphical representation, is that we see the blue here, in-house lobbyists and trade business professional associations effectively are more than around half, non-governmental organizations here, between a third and around a third, a little bit more than that, and professional consultancies are here, excuse me. And then you see in the other parts of the pie graph the other different organizations that are registered in the EU. Okay, the other thing to note, too, is that they don't just lobby members of the executive. You will see that a target of lobbyists that's a very important one are high-level civil servants as well. And in fact, one might argue that within any political system, the real power lies in the bureaucracies, not the executive. So oftentimes their target, it's a good point, oftentimes their target won't be just governments, governments per se in the sense of elected officials, but it will be those people that are leading the bureaucracies as well, that the different political leaders will head. Very important point. Okay. This is all sort of a segue to the idea of how do you try to add more transparency and accountability into this world of lobbying. So we're not going to debate whether or not it's legitimate. We know that it's a legitimate act to lobby. However, there's no harm, and this is the normative argument, in seeing who's lobbying who about what, right? We won't necessarily know the conversations that are being held. But what we want to do is add transparency into the political system so that people are aware of different interest groups trying to influence different actors. Now, the idea here is that if we know who our politicians are talking to, we can also make a more informed decision when we vote. If we see that the Minister for Justice or Foreign Affairs of your country has been talking to people, organizations, corporations that you may not necessarily share the same views with, and you want to send a message to the government in power the next election, you can make an informed decision by seeing and having this information and seeing, well, who's been talking to who, right? That's the idea here. So lobbying regulation is basically having rules that have to be followed by lobbyists in different political systems. We'll go over some of those rules in a second, but the end goal is basically saying this, is if you have rules, particularly making lobbyists register before they seek to influence, people will know who is talking to whom about what, and that will foster not just transparency, but also accountability in your political system as well, right? So it's not just an idea of having a voluntary registry, right, where lobbyists sign up and say on a voluntary basis, all right, I'm going to talk to this person about policy X, Y, or Z. It's having a mandatory registration of lobbyists or anyone that wants to seek to influence a public actor, right? So the other idea here is that with these regulations is if you don't comply with the rules as a lobbyist, you face a potential jail sentence or a fine, okay? So what are the different types of rules that lobbyists would have to follow? Well, the most basic form of lobbying regulation is that registration has to take place. So this means that lobbyists basically have to register before they try to lobby, right? And say who they want to lobby about which particular policy. Now, depending on the regulatory system, and we'll go over those different types of systems, more information has to be given compared to other systems, right? More or less information has to be given. But generally speaking, all laws ask which public officials that lobbyists tend to influence. Now, they might have to give more information such as specific bills or specific policy areas, but in general, it's the idea of who is it that you want to influence. How much money are you going to spend or have you spent in your attempt to influence? So this is the idea of public individual employee spending reports. Then having publicly available lists available so that the public can see who's trying to influence who about what. And this is an important point, and this is pretty salient in most European states. A lot of political actors, a lot of politicians, let's say it, sure, once they leave office, will use the connections they've had or made over the last 4 years and go straight into the world of lobbying, right? And they will do that shamelessly, unfortunately. They will use their contacts and they'll get some very high-paying jobs working as lobbyists. Now, we've seen that throughout all of the EU. There's not one country, and throughout the world for that matter, where you haven't seen that. Well, lobbying regulations, one of the most important points of them is they try to create what's referred to as mandatory cooling off periods. So this basically means that a politician has to wait either 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, depending on the legislation, before they can become a lobbyist. Right? Yeah, right, okay. It's a pretty powerful thing to have that in your political system because it really prevents an abuse of a dominant position that the politicians could have had in their previous life as politicians. All right? So we all know examples of where legislators did not cool off and they went into very high-paying jobs, but countries that have this prevent that from taking place. So this is the fun part for me always is to say, okay, where is in the world that we have lobbying rules and where is it that we don't? Now, generally speaking, there are more countries in the world that don't have lobbying laws compared to countries in the world that do. And I think right now there's 16 jurisdictions in total. We'll talk a bit about each, not each of them, we'll look more at the EU, but generally speaking, if we compare that to, say, freedom of information legislation, which I think you have around 80 or 90 countries in the world that have FOI legislation, There's fewer countries, obviously, that have lobbying regulation. However, it's kind of an exponential growth we've seen. In the 1900s, there was only 4 political systems that had lobbying rules. Today, we have 16, right? Which basically means from 2000 to 2017, there's been almost an exponential growth of countries that have had this, precisely because it is a sunshine law that adds transparency into what goes on in our political system. All right, so it's increasingly become a popular thing. Australia has laws. There's a country that started out with laws earlier, then abandoned them, and now have them again. Austria, Canada has lobbying laws, one of the first original four to have them. I'm talking only about the national systems here, not the provincial or the state levels, but in Canada, several states have them, or some provinces have them as well. Chile has just gotten laws. You can see the whole host of countries that are in white do not have laws, and there you see right at the bottom there. So if anyone's watching from the Greek government, you might want to think about getting some of those. There are no statutory rules right now in Greece. Add some transparency and accountability in your political system. Yes, okay, so France has them and Germany has them as well. Come on, if France can have them, gosh, you should think about getting them here in Greece. Okay, Hungary had laws, but abandoned them under the Fidesz government, which might not surprise you too much if you know a bit about Hungarian politics. Ireland just got rules in 2015 that came into effect. Israel as well. I know Italy's close to, or maybe not implemented yet, but I think they've agreed maybe on something at the national level. Again, most of Asia doesn't have lobbying laws except for Taiwan, interestingly enough. But the big countries like Japan, India, China, well, sure, they don't have lobbying laws as well. Now, in Central and Eastern Europe, the first country to get it was actually Lithuania. Now, here's a question: why do you think a country in Central and Eastern Europe that's relatively obscure, without it being offensive, why would they want to have lobbying laws?
Because of corruption.
Okay, so there could have been the fear that there was too much corruption, this was going to be a way to clean it up. Okay, excellent. Any other ideas why?
Geographical position, close to Russia.
Okay, geographical position close to Russia. Okay, that's good. So you would, draw that out a bit more.
I would assume that they wouldn't want too much interference. They would want to avoid much interference from Russia in their internal politics, and that's something that would happen.
Okay, sure, excellent, good. Okay, good. Any other views? Well, one of the views that came up in our interviews was that it was a way to establish themselves internationally as being a stable and an open democracy, right? So if you have those, even the image of having these transparency laws creates legitimacy for you internationally that will increase investor confidence as well. Okay, so that's that's a really good example of a country you wouldn't have expected to have them. All of North America does now with Mexico, finally since 2010. Netherlands and Poland also have regulations. Portugal, for me, somewhat surprisingly, doesn't yet. It's surprising because I know Transparency International, Portugal is very active in trying to get them. As most of it's a bit of a shout out, I guess, to Transparency International. It's done some excellent work on lobbying laws and its regulation, have been influential in trying to shape the agenda for many governments as well. Slovakia, Slovenia. Okay, Slovenia has laws. Okay, so here, this is, I suppose, the heart of what we want to get to with this. Okay, so we know the U.S. is the first country at the federal level and the national level to have laws since 1946. It has now all states having lobbying laws. There was a short parentheses there where Pennsylvania didn't have it throughout the 2000s, and no one's entirely sure why that happened, but they got it back. So in terms of what we're looking at here a little bit here is what goes on in the European Union. So interestingly, the first institution to have lobbying laws in the EU is the European Parliament in 1996. Now, in terms of your comments that you were saying, a lot of that was a reaction to corruption or perceptions of scandal. You will see a lot of these different political systems create these lobbying laws in the wake of particular scandals or corruption, or the view that we've got to add more transparency to prevent this image that we're corrupt, right? So the EP was a little bit, in terms of motivated by that in 1996. European Commission, on the other hand, notwithstanding, despite all that corruption that happened within the Santer Commission in 1999, if everyone remembers that, right, with basically the Commission getting up to no good in some cases, didn't establish any lobbying laws in the wake of that scandal because it has been historically preferred to have self-regulation. Now, self-regulation basically means that professional lobbyists themselves will hold up their own principles and will act honorably, and you don't have to have any laws to try to regulate their actions in terms of their registration or anything like that. Now, that did change in 2008, however, where they decided to have a voluntary register, and they opened up this interest representation register in 2008. However, both sides finally got together, the Parliament and Commission, to create what's referred to as the Joint Transparency Register in 2011. Now, the difference between the Parliamentary Register in 2009 is that it was mandatory, or sorry, 1996 is that it was mandatory. Whereas the Joint Transparency Register now is effectively still voluntary. Now, we'll talk about how it's de facto mandatory, but still it basically is up to every lobbyist to decide whether or not they want to register. It's not mandatory. And so this is what people say is one of the problems of the European Union Joint Transparency Register, is that there's really no fine or penalty if you break the rules, because there are no rules. Right? Because if it's not mandatory, there's no rules, right? Effectively. So we'll talk about how they've gone around that a little bit. The Council, which is the third main institution at the EU level, does not have rules. Even though independent specific governments in their states will have lobbying regulations, as we've seen here, the Council as an institution does not have rules surrounding it. Okay? It's an important omission, and I think that's raised a lot of question marks as to whether or not it should have been done like that. So this is, I suppose, a bit of a segue to what our research group does. So we're based out of Dublin, and it includes myself, my colleague Gary Murphy out of Dublin City University, John Hogan out of the Dublin Institute of Technology, and our new co-author for the second edition of the book that will be coming out probably next year is Michele Krepads, who's based out of Dublin Institute of Technology as well. Okay, so what we try to do is this, and it's a pretty simple thing to do. It's also a very difficult thing to do, and we've been criticized a lot for it. And a lot of you that will be going on into academia will realize, okay, yeah, it's not always that easy to do academic work because you're open up to criticism. What we've basically done is ask a simple question. All right, we know there's 17 jurisdictions throughout the world that have lobbying laws. How do these laws compare to each other? Right? Now, the question itself is a pretty tricky one. How do you compare Taiwan with the United States and Poland, right? Now, as comparative politics scholars, generally we pick geographic areas to perform comparative analysis. I historically have looked at developments in Western Europe, right? Other colleagues from the States will look at what's going on in the United States, the federal level over time, or maybe compared to state jurisdictions, right? South America, you'd look at South American, Latin American countries. And it's easy to find a common denominator when you're doing it specifically focusing on geographic locations because there's always more similarities than there are differences. When you do global comparisons, you're dealing with a cross-cultural analysis where there's lots of ghosts in different machines. And you're not entirely sure what is the most objective way that I can try to compare what goes on between these different jurisdictions, right? So we'll tell you how we tried to do it, and you'll see why we got criticized for it a little bit, but I guess our answer is always propose something better. What we did was we developed our work based on what was done already in an organization based out of the United States called the Center for Public Integrity. So what the CPI did, in a nutshell, is that it created a series of indicators to try to measure the robustness or the strength of lobbying laws. It asked 48 different questions. I think we'll go through the sort of categories and probably explain to you. They define 8 different dimensions of regulation. So they have different definitions of lobbyists. What is the definition of lobbyists that's encapsulated in the legislation, right? Does it actually look at executive branch lobbying? Does it deal only with lobbying at the legislative level, right? Second dimension, registration. Well, how much detail does each lobbyist have to give when they register? Do they just have to put their name and phone number, or do they have to give information with regard to specific bills they want to influence, specific ministries or departments they want to influence, specific ministers, civil servants. The more information they have to give, the more robust is the legislation. Okay? Employer spending, individual spending disclosures, there's a lot of information have to be given with regard to how much is spent. So what they do is they take these 8 different dimensions, ask a series of 48 questions related to each of those dimensions, and I'll leave this with you guys to look over in more detail, but those would be how we would do the coding anyway. Those are the questions they would ask. Depending on the answer, you'll give it a specific score, right? So is a lobbyist required to file a registration form? Yes, 3. No, 0. So you can see that there's different scores for different questions. To make a long story short, 48 questions, you sum the total of each of those answers. The closer it is to 100, the more robust or strong is the legislation, right? Meaning it promotes more transparency and accountability. So what we effectively did is we took this CPI scoring and we said, okay, well, they did it in the States for all 51 jurisdictions. Let's take that method of analysis and look at every piece of legislation that has lobbying laws and ask those same 48 questions, right? And then we'll see the point score we get for each of the countries. And looking at those point scores for all 16 jurisdictions, we'll see who has the strongest regulation or not, right? All right, we thought it was a pretty objective analysis of how to come up with scores until we talked to some countries that said, well, you know what, we don't have this in Lithuania. I was like, yeah, I know, but okay. So we got criticized that this was a very US-centric method of analysis. So for comparative politics scholars, you're going to get that criticism, particularly if a lot of the literature focuses on the US and a lot of the more methodological innovations come from the US, you might be accused of being US-centric in your own analysis. There's nothing you can do about it, as long as it's an accepted thing. Here's this, before we break up here are the different scores that we arrived at. All right, so after the break, we'll talk a little bit about the classification scheme, but here are the different scores. So, and this is why we got criticized. I think it was, do I say the country? We were giving evidence, I think it was in Czech Republic, yeah. Got some shout-outs from the audience basically saying, well, of course the U.S. is going to be the highest. They developed this, right? And I was like, well, not really. I don't think the Center for Public Integrity purposely put U.S. legislation in 07 at 62. But effectively, it is the highest scoring index, and these are even, somewhat surprisingly, someone would say, based on reforms that was done by the Bush administration, that actually increased the robustness of the U.S. legislation. So the U.S. is at the top there at 62, and then you have Canada 50, and different jurisdictions notwithstanding from Europe and Australia. Between this band, we'll talk about this after the break, between 30 and 59, which we call medium regulation systems, but you do see a whole whole host of North American, European, Australian, and EU level countries within this medium band regulatory strength. For the purposes of this class, what's interesting is that if we look at the EP legislation of 1996, it scored relatively low, right? However, with different iterations, including that of the Commission in 08, up to the Joint Transparency Register, we see that the rules are becoming stronger. So we refer to this a little bit in terms of policy learning. Jurisdictions learn from what they've done, they learn from what they've done well, but also what they haven't done well. And they'll make the legislation accordingly stronger or more robust as time goes on. In fact, you'll see that that's the case of the European Union as well. We see that in France. I think this is the 09 legislation. We recently scored the amended legislation, and I think it is now, it's well over 30 as well. So you will generally see countries starting off maybe at a low point, making changes then to make more transparent and accountable their actual regulatory systems, and making them stronger by having higher point scores. So that's generally what you find. I think Poland is in the process of doing that as well. So that's just something to think about. But I guess the bottom line is that we took this method of analysis from the United States, applied it to countries throughout the world, and we're able to now relatively neatly compare these different jurisdictions and how they compare to each other. So what we'll do is now, after the break, we'll talk about the theoretical classifications of these different types of systems, and then the pros and the cons of lobbying regulation. Okay, thanks.